Kyle Van Noy went off on the haters that don't like the Ravens pass rushing situation too much, and Baltimore Ravens fans clapped back. We talk about that. Lamar Jackson laughing at Stephen A. Smith and so much more coming up next on Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Oestreicher of Ravens Wire, here with you on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here, making Locked On Ravens a part of your day, your first listen each and every single day. And we are free and available for you on all podcasting platforms, including in video form on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe to the channel, and in audio form, where you can follow along and subscribe. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We're a 5-day-a-week Ravens podcast. So every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, we are here for you with daily Ravens coverage. Plus, we go live after every single Ravens game, after every piece of Ravens big news. And of course, sometimes on the weekend, we have some bonus episodes if the headlines permit. We might be having one this weekend. So not sure yet, but could be a possibility. Today's episode of Locked On Ravens is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Offseason in full swing. Drafts less than a month away now. It's crazy we've gotten to this point. Of course, we're going to have continuing to talk about Baltimore's draft needs, which we're going to get to in the final part of the show. But today's storylines pertain around Kyle Van Noy, particularly. In the first part of the show, we're going to get into him really going off on his haters and the Ravens pass rushing haters, and Ravens fans actually kind of clapping back at him about the situation. Then in the second part of the show, Lamar Jackson is having some fun watching LeBron James roast Stephen A. Smith. He laughed at the whole situation on Instagram late last night, and it brings me to a different conversation about Lamar, just about him, not only just in the media conversations, but also how much of his success gets amplified. There's a lot of blame that gets put on him. So I want to dive into a deeper Lamar conversation in the second part of the show. Let's get into Kyle Van Noy, though. Van Noy was his birthday yesterday, so happy birthday to Kyle Van Noy. And I guess, hey, did we give him a pass here for kind of going off? Said thank you for the birthday wishes and was very appreciative of all the love that he got. But he made sure yesterday to make his opinion known. Obviously, it was his 34th birthday. So again, Kyle Van Noy still doing awesome things while getting up there in the football world, at least in terms of age. The account NFL Stats put out his stats from last season, where he had 16 games, 41 tackles, 21 quarterback hits, 14 tackles for loss, 12 and a half sacks, 2 passes defended, 2 forced fumbles, 1 fumble recovery, and obviously he was a Pro Bowler last year. Again, unreal stuff. Kyle Van Noy, at least in terms of sacks, was the Ravens' best pass rusher, and I just think overall he was the Ravens' best pass rusher, or at least most consistent pass rusher there. So then Kyle Van Noy, he comments, he quote tweets it, and he says, not bad for a team with no pass rush. And look, if you've been following the Ravens, if you're a Ravens fan, you know the controversy with Baltimore's pass rushing situation. It is that they need the guy at edge rusher. The pass rush is inconsistent at times, and sometimes they do not show up in the biggest moments. Now, that doesn't mean I think the Ravens pass rush is bad, but I do think that there is room for improvement. So Ravens fans started to get in the comments and kind of voice their displeasure with the pass rushing situation about, some fans saying, there's still no pass rush. And, there's all this different stuff about how at this point, okay, how many times does the pass rush actually disappear in those big moments? Doesn't show up when it matters, et cetera, et cetera. So Kyle Van Noy decided to make his thoughts a little bit more known on the situation. He ended up talking about, there was a fan, Jordan, who said they say being top 5 in the league as a team with sacks don't matter. They say your sacks are in garbage time. You didn't show up when it matters. Obviously, he wasn't actually believing those points. He was just putting them out there. And Kyle Van Noy says, they say a lot. Y'all have no idea what we are being coached to do. How many running QBs did we play last year? Do you know what we were told to do playing 10-plus running QBs? How many chips in Max Pro did we face from weeks 4 to 10? What about the slide of the line. Also, we take PFF as law now. Like, they know everything. And I know there's controversy around PFF. Kyle Van Noy certainly making it known that he might not be as big of a fan of PFF as other people. And again, the fan Jordan says, "Oh, trust me," in response. He says, "Oh, trust me, we're on the same page," but they don't want to hear the excuses. They expect y'all to get consistent pressure week in and week out. They say y'all was MIA against the Bills. That's one reason why we lost. There was no pass rush. Y'all couldn't get after Allen. Kyle Van Noy responded to that and saying he passed the ball 22 times and completed 16 for 127. Come on. We didn't stop the run in the game in the first half. That's why we lost. Stop it. So Kyle Van Noy is very adamant here. Pass rush, not as bad as people make it out to be in Baltimore. He also had a response to a tweet about, his career resume, which is unbelievable, by the way. And at the bottom, it says, "Should have retired a Patriot." And he said, "Yep, shoulda, woulda, coulda, we shall see." Not sure if he was talking about, him going back to New England or his resume. That's what he was saying yep to, but that's a whole different conversation. To the pass rush. This has so many different layers to it, if we're being honest. Like, there are multiple layers we're going to have to get into here with this pass rushing situation. My take on the pass rush, just from a very general perspective, and I'm curious as to what other people think about Baltimore's pass rush right now as it currently stands. Because, again, let's just go through it. Kyle Van Noy, Odafe Owe, Tavius Robinson, David Ojabo, Adisa Isaac. At least on the edge. We're going to get into the interior guys in a minute. On the edge, I feel like they do need more. Now, that doesn't mean they have to completely overhaul their room. I think that there's still could be change on the horizon. I'm not sure what that looks like, but there are still veteran pass rush options available that could help the Ravens out. In terms of Baltimore last season, it wasn't like they were this terrible, horrible pass rushing team in terms of the actual stats that go into it. I mean, you have a Baltimore team that, yes, you talk about the names, and I actually talked about this on the NFL Squad show that comes out every week, Locked On NFL Squad show. The Ravens are the only team in their division that don't have the guy. Cleveland has Myles Garrett, maybe even Abdul Carter by the time next month is over. But Cleveland has Myles Garrett. Cincinnati, for the time being, has Trey Hendrickson, but who knows how that's going to play out. And then Pittsburgh, obviously, with TJ Watt. Right now, Baltimore is the only team that when you look at their roster, it's like, okay, Kyle Van Noy is their number one pass rusher. I know some people might say Odafe Owe, but I'm not. I don't know. I'm not really in that camp. I'm much more in the Odafe Owe is number 2 and Kyle Van Noy is number 1. Looking at the overall stats for 2024 defense for Baltimore's pass rush, they were number 2 in sacks. They had 54 sacks on the season. Only Denver had more. You look at their quarterback knockdowns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They were 10th in quarterback knockdowns. They were a little bit more in the middle of the pack in terms of hurries, but you can also look at blitz percentage where they were towards the bottom of the league. You have a team that ended up being 26th in blitz percentage at 20.3. You can even look at for the pressures. Baltimore, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They were 8th in pressures. Pressure percentage, they're a little further down. So it wasn't like they were, again, this bad pass rushing team. But I think that, again, you talk about the big moments sometimes where it was a little bit inconsistent. Not saying they were awful in those moments, but it was inconsistent. I think for guys like Nnamdi Madubuike, who had to face a lot more double teams this past season, you have to take advantage of that. And I think that Baltimore did to an extent. Obviously, second in sacks is nothing to scoff at here. But to me, it's going after, and again, I'm just throwing Micah Parsons, his name out just to throw it out. But if Baltimore were to get a player like Micah Parsons, I think a lot shifts and a lot changes for you. So I think as a Darius Smith or Matt Judon would help out, but it's not just on the edge rushers, right? It really isn't. Zach Ward talked about this on the lounge. I think that when you talk about sacks, when you talk about pressure, a lot of that, in fact, sometimes all of it is put on the edge rushers in terms of perspective about pass rushing, where the defensive linemen, the interior guys, the big boys up front, they're not factored into that equation when they absolutely should be. I just talked about Nnamdi Madubuike, Travis Jones as well. Those are players. You push the pocket, you make an impact. And I think that there, Michael Pierce had some of that as well. But essentially, I think you have 4 consistent options on your entire defensive line in terms of pass rushers. And even I think for Odafe Owe, he has really great games like that 3-sack game against Pittsburgh, and then he'll end up faltering and not having a sack for 2, 3, 4 weeks. So I think it's Van Noy, Owe, and then on the defensive line on the interior, it's Madubuike and Travis Jones. Those are your 4 consistent guys. Whereas you can't trust David Ojabo at this point. Tavius Robinson showed flashes, and I expect him to have a huge year next season, but I think that's more in run defense with a sprinkle of pass rush in there, which I expect to be improved. Broderick Washington has not really shown much since his contract extension. Flip it back out to edge. Adisa Isaac is unproven. The talent is there, unproven. I think that it would help to bring in some vets. I just think that for Kyle Van Noy, he understands what the group did as a whole last season. And look, I don't blame him for being upset that the narrative is what it is. But I also think, and shout out to Yuri for bringing up these stats here, because it does put a little more in perspective. And we talked about the Ravens being second in sacks and all this in pressure rate, top 10, et cetera, et cetera. You look at some of these other things. Kyle Van Noy, 13 sacks, which was tied for 5th in the league, 52 pressures, 24th, 11.9 pass rush win rate, which was 51st. Odafe Owe, he had 10 sacks, which was 15th, 48 pressures, 29th, 13.2 pass rush win rate, 39th. David Ojabo, 2 sacks, 98th, 12 pressures, 108th, 6.5 pass rush win rate, 100th. Tavius Robinson, 4 sacks, tied 69th, 17 pressures, 97th, 5.3 pass rush win rate, 113th. So I think that there is something to be desired still with this Baltimore pass rush. Obviously, you can even go a little deeper and talk about how not only does pass rush impact getting to the quarterback and sacks and incompletions, hurried throws, but it impacts your secondary as well, because coverage sacks are real. But also, if your pass rush can get there and force those hurried throws, it gives your secondary so many more opportunities. Your defense works in tandem. All 3 levels work in tandem, because you can also talk about, okay, if you're blitzing Roquan up the middle, Arthur Millette, well, I know Arthur Millette didn't play a lot last season, but, guys coming off the edge, Kyle Hamilton, they love blitzing Kyle Hamilton. It all factors in. I just think that the edge rushers have to take on all of the burden. So I understand both sides, where I am of the mindset that Baltimore does need more at the pass rusher spot, particularly on the edge. I just think there aren't as many consistent options as you need to be. I think you have 1 3/4 consistent options out of the 5 guys you already have on the roster, which really can't be if you want to win a Super Bowl. I think you have to have at least 2, if not 3 guys that can be consistent on the edge. And that's not mentioning interior guys. You have 2 guys on the interior that you can count on. But at the same time, I do think that the pass rush does get a little bit of a bad rep, but I think that it is probably their biggest need here. I think some people go secondary, other people go offensive line. I would still consider pass rush Baltimore's biggest need, and I hope they do add someone. I think that you can add a player that can complement Kyle Van Noy and a guy like Odafe Owe and on the interior. Let's just throw out, we talk about the former Ravens situation all the time. What if it's Calais Campbell on the interior and Matt Judon on the outside? I think that, or those 2 guys paired with a rookie at each spot, will, first of all, force some tough roster decisions. But second of all, I think you just feel a lot more comfortable, because let's go. I'm trying to do this more. I'm going to do it here. But actually, we're going to do it in the second part of the show. I teased it. So be sure to stay tuned. We'll be right back here on Locked On Ravens talking about the end of our pass rush conversation with a key point, as well as Lamar Jackson laughing at Stephen A. Smith. Don't go anywhere. Stay tuned. First, the show is brought to you by Gametime. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy of the crowd, and witnessing unforgettable moments. There's nothing like experiencing a big game in person. Getting tickets shouldn't be stressful. That's where Gametime comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. Gametime Picks has curation that makes it easier to find better value for tickets to sports, concerts, comedy, theater, and so much more. Lowest price guarantee or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference on super deals. And with seat views before you buy, no surprise fees, and a lowest price guarantee, you can book with total confidence and have peace of mind. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Back here, Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher here with you still on this Thursday edition of the show. We're going to round out our pass rushing conversation. I teased it in the first part of the show as we were heading into our first break because I wanted to make sure I got the point across here. If you look at the Ravens pass rushing situation, I mentioned you have 4 consistent options right now. What if one of those guys goes down? I mean, let's imagine, and knock on wood, this doesn't happen. Let's imagine a nightmare scenario where you lose one of Nnamdi Madubuike and Travis Jones and one of Calvin Noy and Lafayette. You're left in a really bad spot there with unproven guys that, yeah, hey, maybe that guy works out this year. But that's not the mindset of a competing team. We literally talked about this with Chidobe Awuzie, who the Ravens signed on Tuesday. I mean, you could have gone into the year with TJ Tampa as your number 3 corner, but if Marlon, Humphrey, or Nate Wiggins goes down, that's a lot to put on an unproven guy, and there's a shot it works out. TJ Tampa is a very talented player, but you want to have that veteran buffer, that veteran shield, or just that shield in general to be like, okay, there's enough depth to withstand 1 or 2 injuries at this position. I don't think the Ravens have enough depth at both defensive lineman and edge rusher to withstand an injury to one of their top guys, and that is an issue. So as we talk about, it doesn't have to be this big flashy signing. They don't have to bring in the best defense. They don't have to lure Aaron Donald out of retirement and bring him back, right? It can be a guy like Calais Campbell, like we talked about. But I just think that the depth there is very, very important. It's important at every position. But again, Baltimore's pass rush was not bad last season. It really was not bad. I just think the inconsistent moments, when they didn't show up, it was loud, right? I think that was it. When they did show up, it was loud too in a good way. But obviously people will look at the negatives and say, well, when it mattered most, sometimes that pass rush didn't come to the table, and that's what you kind of look at, especially with the way the season ended. I know that was probably left a sour taste, and left a sour taste in my mouth for sure. Left a sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. So that's the conversation on the pass rush. Let's move on to Lamar Jackson. He was laughing at Stephen A. Smith along with many other people last night. If you haven't kept up with the whole LeBron James situation, Stephen A. Smith has made some comments about Bronny James, who is LeBron James's son. Both of them play on the Lakers together. And LeBron James took exception, went up to Stephen A. at a Lakers game, and it's just caused this whole thing. And now it's escalated to the point where Stephen A. is saying he would have swung at LeBron if LeBron put his hands on him. And so LeBron posted a clip of Stephen A. doing like some kind of a weak boxing exercise, and everybody's clowning, everybody's getting in on the fun. And Lamar was one of those people who commented on the post, 3 laughing, crying emojis with a chill. I think that for Stephen A., and he's been somebody that I think with Lamar and this whole, the Stephen A. Lamar Jackson arc, you can talk about arcs with a lot of media members with Lamar. Stephen A. has been one of the weirder ones. You know, he's expressed his support for Lamar on some occasions, but for the most part, it has been, whether it's subtle shots or just straight up disrespect or whatever it is. I mean, we've talked about it plenty on the show. Stephen A. has this weird thing with Lamar, even to the point where last season he was trying to claim that Lamar's camp reached out to him about the MVP, saying, oh, this about the MVP, you know, Orlovsky's right, da-da-da, like, and Lamar ended up actually taking to social media and disputing that claim. He's like, my camp? Like, what? So Stephen A. is I don't know, very controversial, obviously. And I think, you know, for what he wants to do, being controversial is kind of what he wants. So it is what it is. But it brings up another conversation, because I think with these, you know, national media, who obviously you're looking at a bunch of different sports. They're trying to cover, you know, everything on a daily basis, which is a lot, right? Like the reason that I am grateful that I get to do this show on Locked On Ravens, one of the many reasons I feel like I'm grateful and really appreciative of doing this, is that we're a singular focused show. We focus on the Baltimore Ravens, and we bring in outside perspectives. We talk about other teams when it pertains to the Ravens, but, you know, NFL, I've done NFL national shows. I continue to do NFL national shows. And it's a different dynamic of, you know, we are so laser focused on this team, where obviously all of us, you know, we watch this team, we read about this team, we keep up with this team. And so we are able to identify everything about it. Whereas national media members who are stretched thin, they don't have time and opportunity to watch every single game, time and opportunity to deep dive into a lot of things about every single team, not just football, but you go basketball, baseball, sport, all the sports. And so when it's Stephen A. and when it's one of these other people, there are a lot of good, hardworking national media people that do take the time to do that, right? It's 100%, but it's hard to do it all of the time. Whereas for local shows, it's easier because, I'm not sitting here watching 10 hours of Seahawks film, right? I don't do that because, yes, when the Ravens play the Seahawks, it's important to watch film on the opposing team, but I'm not doing 10 hours a day of Seahawks film. That's just not what I do here. So when you talk about Lamar Jackson and some of the narratives that he is faced with compared to other quarterbacks, especially in the national media landscape, first of all, yes, they're absolutely unfair, and we've talked about them before. Whereas Lamar has gotten blamed for his receivers' faults, for his offensive line's faults, for his defense's faults, for his coach's fault. Now, let me make this clear too. Lamar is not absolved of all blame here, right? Obviously, there are things Lamar has not done over the course of his career to get over the hump to the Super Bowl and this, that, and the other. But Stephen A. is one of the people who, in that same clip about, Lamar's campus reached out to me, there was a whole separate thing about, you're talking about beating the Pittsburgh Steelers, and he can't beat the Pittsburgh Steelers. And it was very interesting how that all went down. He said, quote, "You don't need to be chirping about him being an MVP when you can't beat the Pittsburgh Steelers, considering what they've had at their disposal over the last few years." Now, Lamar Jackson quickly shut that whole thing up by just dominating Pittsburgh over Baltimore's final 2 outings against them. But even still, people who watch Lamar Jackson on film, people who watch Baltimore every single week in depth and kind of keep up with the team, I mean, everybody knows Lamar is one of the best in the league. Lamar has grown tremendously. There are still outdated narratives that are being pushed about him today. Again, Lamar hasn't been good enough in the playoffs at times, but he's getting flack for at least the majority of it for the Bills loss, where, yes, Lamar was to blame in that game. Obviously, the fumble and the interception on the miscommunication. But Mark Andrews had a part to play. Kyle Van Noy said, we talked about it in the first part of the show, the defense had a part to play. But being the quarterback, there's always going to be that expectation on you that, yes, you are going to shoulder a lot of it. As that's the same thing with the head coach. If your offensive coordinator makes bad play calls, if your defensive coordinator makes bad play calls, yeah, they're going to get blamed for it. But a lot of that does fall back on the head coach, especially when there is a narrative or history about that. And so doesn't help. Lamar hasn't had playoff success generally. But then it feels like his playoff wins have been swept under the rug. Like, what happened to that Pittsburgh game where they blew out the Steelers at home, or the Houston game last season, like 2 years ago, when they did the same thing? Those are the games that get swept under the rug for the greater narrative that I think people want to push about Lamar, whether it be nationally or just other outlets or whatnot. So again, he'll get his blame and he deserves some of it for sure. But other parts of it, it's just like, what are we talking about here? Or are we watching the same games because Lamar is getting punished for things, or I guess talked about in the way that really shouldn't be happening? So he had some fun at Stephen A's expense. I think a lot of people did last night, and that whole situation with LeBron, Bronny, Stephen A, I don't think is over in the slightest. So coming up in the final part of the show, we'll pivot away from that, talk about Baltimore's biggest draft needs, because the Ravens have given themselves free agency freedom, and that obviously translates over to the draft. So be sure to stay tuned. A lot coming your way on Locked On Ravens. Back here, Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher still here with you, rocking out on this Thursday edition of the show. Appreciate everybody for being here again, making Locked On Ravens a part of your day, your first listen each and every single day. Whether you're an everyday or you listen every single day, or it's your first time into the show, or you're just stopping by again after not checking in for a while. Really appreciate everybody, all of the support here. Be sure to tell a friend and tell a family member as well that if they want the Ravens perspective on things or daily Ravens coverage, we have you covered every single weekday, plus more on Locked On Ravens. Draft, as I mentioned at the top of the show, less than a month away, which is crazy. I don't know where the time goes. I mean, I started doing this show in 2019, Lamar's second season, first full year as the starter there. First ever episode was on Kari Vedvik, which is a blast from the past, I know. But even that doesn't feel that long ago, and it also feels like forever ago. Time is weird. That's all I'll say about that. Time is weird. But the draft's coming up in less than a month. Baltimore, as I kind of teased in the second part of the show, coming into the break there, they've given themselves freedom. They really have. Coming into the offseason, there were always a couple of highlighted needs. And not that they don't have highlighted needs now, but obviously offensive tackle, if Ronnie Stanley didn't come back, was the big one. I feel like Baltimore, not that they would have done this, but I feel like they would have felt more pigeonholed into taking an offensive tackle, especially if they didn't re-sign Ronnie Stanley and then didn't get a veteran to replace him. People would be looking at the offensive tackle class, maybe even asking Baltimore to trade up to go get their future tackle, a guy that can play for you for 10 years. But Ronnie's back. You don't have to worry about that. You can still take an offensive lineman. I know the guard position is certainly one that, makes a lot of sense. If a guy like Tyler Booker falls, that's a guy that's not athletic, but he's a dude. And I think he's going to have a successful 10 to 12 year career wherever he goes. But I'm looking more defense for Baltimore, for being honest. Not that the whole draft has to be defensive, but if we're just talking about first round pick, we kind of outlined it in the first part of the show at the pass rush. I think that if there is a defensive lineman in this class that you really like in the first round, he's one of your top guys, that's a good option. The edge rusher class, if there's a guy that falls to you, there are options there. But this is a very deep defensive line class. I think that you can honestly wait on a defensive lineman until, honestly, end of day 2, early day 3, and you will still be getting probably anywhere from very late first to late second value on guys that last year would have been taken in that range. But this year's class is so deep, you can take a Darius Alexander or a Jordan Phillips or some of those other guys that are mid-round players that would have gone earlier in other classes. But I think secondary is probably where they will go in the first round. That's my prediction. Now, corner is a room that's interesting for Baltimore. We outlined it with Chidobe Awuzie coming in, Marlon, Humphrey, Nate Wiggins, TJ Tampa, Jalen Armour-Davis. Those are your 5 right now. And I think like a Savon Rivel is a guy that is intriguing. He probably would be a top 10 talent in this class had he not torn his ACL. But maybe it's him. I do look at the safety position, though, as the one that I feel like Baltimore is probably going to go with here. Now, that's not set in stone, obviously. There are so many positions they could go in the first round. But a player like a Nick Emanwari, Malachi Starks, if you want to go a little further down the class, guys like Xavier Watts, etc., there are options for Baltimore at the safety spot. And I think that forming a 3-headed monster with Kyle Hamilton, Ardarius Washington, and whoever that safety would be, I think that's the way to go, because we know the Baltimore had a really, really good defense when Kyle Hamilton was back there in the deep part of the field. That was based off of, obviously, necessity, right? Because, the Ravens had the Marcus Williams situation, the Eddie Jackson situation. But I think that having the freedom to move Kyle Hamilton all around is the way you want to go. Now, you could also make the argument that Baltimore could trade up. You could make the argument Baltimore could trade back, or they just stay put. But I think that coming out of this draft, you have to have at least 2 defensive linemen. Well, I'd say maybe, let's rephrase that. 1 defensive lineman, I'd say 1 edge rusher at least, 1 wide receiver late, 1 safety, 1 or 2 corners, and probably at least 2, if not 3 offensive linemen. Now, other positions you could add, you could go for a 4th tight end if you wanted to. You could go for another special teams linebacker, which I expect them to. I think kicker is a position they will look at as well. Backup quarterback is set. I don't think they're going to address that. Running back, you have talented running backs. Depending on how Baltimore feels about keeping Mitchell and Rasheen Ali, maybe they take a guy, but that would give you 5 running backs. So we've identified, it's guard, it's edge, it's defensive line, it's corner, it's safety. Those are your top 5. But you have 11 picks. People will say, well, the Ravens should consolidate. They should trade up, and they should move off 3 of those picks and finish the draft with 8. I hear you. But I think that with what Baltimore has, I would expect them to finish with the absolute minimum 9. I'd say absolute minimum is going to be 9 picks. If there's a guy like Tyler Booker that falls, or Jihad Campbell, one of those players, and that can be another pick too. Like if a Jihad Campbell falls to you who has that inside-outside flexibility at linebacker, and he's getting into like the 22, 23 range, and you're picking a 27, I could see Baltimore saying, hey, we're going to move up 4 spots. We'll give you our 3rd this year, and that'll be it. And there you go. Now you get a really talented player. I thought they should have traded up for Kyle Hamilton back in 2022. They obviously took the risk to not do that, and it worked out for them, but it doesn't work out that way every single time. So Baltimore they have needs. They have needs, but it's not like you are forced into taking a guy at 27 or with your first pick just because you have a big glaring need. Baltimore's a BPA team through and through. That's what I expect them to continue to do. And for the Ravens, it is how they have built their team over the years, and it has been a successful formula for them for the most part. That's all I have for you here today, though, on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for tuning in to the show. On the way out, hit that like and subscribe button in video form. Hit that follow along and subscribe button in audio form as well for 5 days a week plus more of daily Ravens coverage. Coming up tomorrow, we will be rounding out the week with more Ravens coverage and content. So be sure to stay tuned. I'll see you right back here tomorrow on Locked On Ravens.